Good evening. My name is Mohammed Fraser Rahim, and you are at the right location. You are at a Quilliam Foundation event, and we are delighted to have you on this very interesting time in the world. I'm the Executive Director of North America and made it across the pond, and I think tonight we have a really enriching conversation with Maajid Nawaz and Trevor Phillips. Just in terms of a few housekeeping items, I think are rather important in light of the times that we live. No handshaking. No selfies. There are plenty of hand sanitizers in the back. The loo is downstairs, first floor for women, and then in the basement for men too as well. So we want to cover those bases. Ideally, please turn your phone on mute or turn it off for, I think, an enlightened conversation. And just a few other housekeeping items in light of the situation that certainly is taking place all throughout the world with coronavirus. Our previous speaker, Ayan Hirsi Ali, just out of an abundance of caution, was not able to attend. So we just wanted to thank you all for being able to join us tonight in light of the dynamics. I want to go over the agenda just so that we're clear in terms of how we're going to cover and move things forward. So we'll begin for the next few minutes. I will scene set, frame the conversation. And then for about 10 minutes, we'll have Trevor Phillips offer some introductory remarks. Preceding Maajid Nawaz, who will offer an additional 10 minutes. And then we will have a time where they will be in conversation for about 20 to 25 minutes. And then we will have plenty of time for Q&A, where I will help facilitate that conversation. And then we'll wrap up roughly around 7:55, 8 o'clock. So what I would like to, I think, highlight, which is, I think, certainly important as it relates to this conversation tonight, as it addresses anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim hatred, the far left, far right, and Islamists, is this current conversation that we're living in. I hail and run our offices in Washington, D.C., and so these issues are not solely focused in the UK context. We see in the United States a polarizing world. We saw just this past year, unfortunately, the morphing, if you will, of groups that are not just traditionally Islamists. We have the emergence of Black Hebrew Israelites. If you've certainly heard of the attacks that took place in Jersey City, in New Jersey, and also the Hanukkah attacks. So we're seeing a morphing, a new form of extremism in many different forms, which are certainly concerning to all of us. Also, I think it's important to highlight is that we have to address this conversation of what pluralism means, what tolerance and inclusion, and what are our shared values. In the United Kingdom, there are shared value systems of being both British, in multi-religious, multi-ethnic society. In the United States, this is the same conversation that rises up to as well. And so I think tonight I wanted you just collectively for us all to think about this heightened state of society in which we are in and where things are going, the political nature of this as well. I have a book that just came out about 3 weeks ago, and it's titled America's Other Muslims, Imam Warthi Muhammad, Islamic Reform in the Making of American Islam. And I think even in that conversation, it is that American Muslims are diverse. They don't all look the same. I come from generations of African Americans who are descended in enslaved Africans, and we have Christians and Muslims and non-religious individuals in our families. And so I think it's important to look at this in a broad scope, not just in the UK context, but certainly globally as well. I think just a few other things to mention as well is the Crest Advisory Independent Consultant Crime Consultancy mentioned. You probably have heard about it, but I think just for us to shape this conversation, that says 63% of British Muslims did not identify with Islamist extremism, they denounced it. And then 64% also trusted the police. So this challenges the assumption that in some shape or fashion that British Muslims are not willing or not wanting to be part of the society and certainly have their concerns as well. And I think the same sort of data could be pulled from Pew Data Poll or Gallup right in the United States as well. So again, just wanted to put a few data sets out there just to frame the conversation, because we will have an enriching conversation between two very accomplished individuals. To my right, your left, we have Trevor Phillips, who is a well-known writer, broadcaster, businessman, chairman of the Green Park Group, a leading executive recruitment consultancy, and co-founder of the data analytics firm Weber Phillips created with Professor Richard Weber in 2014. if you allow me, just to, for the sake of brevity, to as well, a long-standing, rich legacy in terms of his written analysis, regularly contributing to UK's biggest selling newspapers, including the Daily Mail, the Sun, etc., on a wide variety of subjects. He himself has been a champion and a founding chair of both the Greater London Authority and the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and from his days as a student, certainly a rich tradition of being a thinker and intellectual as well. To my right, your left, we have Maajid Nawaz, who is a counter-extremist author, columnist, broadcaster, and founding chairman of Quilliam, a global activist organization that certainly you are familiar with, and deals with matters of integration, citizenship, identity, religious pluralism, etc. Maajid's rich legacy, certainly, or notoriety, is coming from his time being a former member of a global Islamist network, having served 40 years as an Amnesty International adopted prisoner of conscience in Egypt. Maajid is now a leading critic of his former Islamist ideological dogma, while remaining a secular liberal Muslim. For the sake of time, I think you can do a Google search of these two very accomplished individuals who are really going to allow us to dive into a really robust conversation. So I will stop there. We'll have plenty of time for us to have a robust dialogue. I will pass the mic along to Trevor Phillips, who will make some introductory remarks at 10 minutes. I'm going to cap it at 10 minutes, so I will be keeping the stopwatch. Thank you.
The applause is for you, Mohammed. It's an indication. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. It means that for once I don't have to make clear that I am not the Trevor that most people think they've come to see. I'm McDonald. I'm the other guy. But what I perhaps also add to the biography is that as of Monday, I became a regular columnist of the Times. This has been planned for some time. And I had a peculiar conversation with my editor last week in which he said, first column on Monday, you need to sort of just kind of announce yourself. Do you think you've got anything that you really want to deal with on Monday? And then we had a different kind of conversation. I have 10 minutes to kick this off, and I'm going to be as brisk as I can. I am not, you'll be absolutely relieved to hear, going to spend a lot of time dealing with the affairs of the Labour Party, which seem to me secondary to the more important questions on which this session was originally called. And it's a privilege to be standing in for Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who, again, another factor, the fact that Mohammed doesn't really know me. I mean, she is actually an intellectual. I'm not. I am a practical wordsmith. I want to deal with what I think are some of the underlying questions. If you talk to people about public affairs these days, the most characteristic sentence that you will hear from people, and there are various varieties of it depending on how vulgar or how highbrow people are about our times, it goes something like this. What do you think? Trump, Brexit, WTF? I mean, we are constantly we are in a world where everything we think is true, everything we think is going to be predictable turns out not to be. Well, of course, we are at a time of enormous disruption, and that is global. In summary, I mean, this is where I start in my thinking about most issues these days. There are three great factors facing us when we think about the disrupted world in which we live. First and foremost, technology. We are pretty much in the same place as they were when the railways came about, were introduced a couple of centuries ago, when we knew it was going to make a difference, but nobody had any idea how much a difference, and in what ways. Today, the digital universe is the same. We know that it will transform our children's lives, already has, and that our grandchildren will live in a completely different way. We don't quite know what that way is, but day in, day out, we see dramatic changes in the way that we live. Secondly, demographics, and that's both domestic. Within 15 years, the population of over 85s in this country will double. The balance will change dramatically. How we spend our money, what we need to worry about, will be transformed. And globally, Africa will add 1 billion people to its population. That continent already, population under 15 is 50% of the total. We are entering a different world. And the third, which you might say is more subjective, is what we sometimes call diversity. Now, I tend to think of this much more as a world in which people are freer than they ever have been, certainly in my lifetime, to express and inhabit their full identities. Their identities as men, or women, as Christians, as Muslims, as Buddhists, as LGBT, straights, whatever. That disabled people no longer have to hide away. This is a better world, but it is a world in which the fact that we no longer have to hide our identities and defer to the dominant identity, white, male, Christians, means that there will be frictions. They've always done it their way. For the first time in my lifetime, others are getting a voice. And that did not happen without struggle, and it will not take place as we go along without frictions. We know already that the slogan that James Carville put up on Bill Clinton's campaign headquarters, in Bill Clinton's campaign headquarters in 1992, is "The economy stupid," no longer pertains. Lord Ashcroft did a survey after the 2016 Brexit referendum, and what it showed was this. The division between the tribes of Leavers and Remainers was not economic. If you ask people who voted in that referendum what their attitude towards capitalism, they split 51-49. Leavers split 51-49. Remainers split 51-49. Where was the real difference? The difference was if you asked them about feminism. Remainers, 3-2 in favour. Leavers, 3-1 against. Multiculturalism, Remainers, 2-1 in favour. Leavers, 3-1 against. The better slogan than "It's economy stupid" today would be "It's identity, you idiot." So when we come to these issues of anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim prejudice, issues which used to be for the seminar room are, or on the edge of the world, are now at the centre of our societies. As you will know, the issues for which the Labour Party has decided I am no longer suitable to be a member surrounded my desire, first of all, to seek honest journalism on the question of grooming of young, particularly young women in the north of this country. And it seems that the Labour Party believes that reporting these things honestly amounts to a kind of prejudice. Interestingly, it seems they also think that people who come from minority backgrounds are incapable of having a sense of humour. Myself and an old comrade, Peter Tatchell, who nobody, I mean, you know, people can and do say all sorts of things about me, and it's true, you know, I'm a horrible bigot, really, but nobody can say that about Peter Tatchell. This is a man who has suffered indignities and injury, still, essentially, is disabled because of the beating administered by Rob Mugabe's thugs. I said to him on a platform rather like this, I may be the only person here who's been nominated as an Islamophobe, as it happens, by an extremist Tehran backing group that thinks gay people ought to be hurled off roofs. And Peter said, I'm jealous. This apparently is evidence of his and my Islamophobia. This is where we are. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on my own background. People in this country know where I've been. 1997, of course, I was the person who commissioned the initial report that brought the word Islamophobia into our discourse. By what we meant by that was, I think, what Maajid means: discrimination against people because of their faith. Something simple and straightforward and uncomplicated. We then said that we needed to make sure that Muslims were protected. The Paret report, which I published, some of you will know about it, in 2000, same thing. And as chair of the Commission for Racial Equality, I found that I didn't have the legal means to protect people who were discriminated against or abused because of their religious background. Because, by the way, the legislation against incitement to racial hatred in 1986 did not protect Muslims. That is why I personally and my organizations lobbied for a law that would protect Muslims. And with, I must say, brilliant work by David Blunkett, Home Secretary, and Charles Clarke, his successor, we got through the 2006 Racial and Religious Hatred Act, which is the legislation that protects Muslims today. It seems bizarre that having done that, it seems that someone can interpret that I am that sort of person. Now, I think part of the problem here, that this has now become a fact-free zone. It is also that there are people who seem to think that being a Muslim is owned by one ethnic group or another. As a matter of fact, in this country, most Asians, of course, South Asian people are not Muslims. And a healthy proportion of Muslim people in this country are not Asians. When we look at the figures of hate crime, which are quite frequently quoted as the big threat, actually, if you ask people who are victims of hate crime, and there are something like 80,000 recorded, or were something like 80,000 recorded last year, and you analyze it by race and by religion, and you look at the number of people who are from an Asian Muslim background, and you say, you had an incident, what do you think the cause was? And that's what police have to ask everybody. They are 9 times as likely to say that it was because of their race as because of their religion. This is important because the person who is the victim of assault or verbal abuse knows what happened. The reason I make this point is because I think that there is a confusion and a conflation going on here, and it's being used and weaponized. We can talk more about that in our conversation, but let me come to my last point in way of setting up this discussion. What is at the heart of the controversy? I freely admit that I have said, and have said many times, Muslims are different. I have said that, and I've said it because I believe it. And the clue is in the name. Why would you call yourself or identify with a faith, a community, if you did not believe something important about it? Well, why? The example this weekend of the cricket club in north of England, which refused a national lottery grant of £2 million, is to me an inspiration. Almost nobody in their right minds, I think people would say, will turn down that kind of money. This club does terrific work with young people. It is scrambling for money. But its Muslim members said, we want to be part of a club, but we will not work as part of an organization that takes money from gambling, because this is against our principles. I wish we had more people in politics who were ready to stand up for their principles as those men do in that cricket club, and ready to say, I know that I can walk away with 2 million quid, but my beliefs are more important to me. That, I think, is a matter of principle. And that is why I say that group is different. Well, there are all sorts of other groups that are different. The one that I come from, Methodist, we are also different. But the point I want to make here is this. What is now being said is that to argue that a group of people have a belief, a culture, that they stand somewhere, is to accuse them of something bad. What kind of world is it where you are accused of being somehow wrong for standing up for what you believe in? In the same way, and this became an issue because when I was chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, I had a big choice to make. It's probably one of the most difficult choices I had to make. There were some adoption agencies that would not recognize same-sex couples. And they were Catholic and Anglican adoption agencies. And they sincerely believed that homosexuality meant that the parents were not suitable for adoption. Now, I come from a community which actually pretty much universally takes that view. I do not. It is also not the legal view in this country. So there was a choice for me. Do I go with the values with which I was brought up, or do I go with the values which this country as a whole has adopted? I chose the latter. I know that there are still people in my own community who think this was a wicked act. The reason I raise this is to say that we cannot continue simply to ignore the fact that people of principle and sincerity hold different views and values. It doesn't make one look bad and one look good. But you cannot deal with these problems, you cannot negotiate, you cannot find a solution if you do not recognize the differences. And worst of all, what I most loathe about this is saying that people are not different. It's so disrespectful. It is like saying, actually, they've only just discovered our ways. When they get, 10, 15, 20 years in, they'll know our ways are so much better, and they'll abandon those silly, superstitious traditions. Well, I don't buy that. I believe that people believe things for good reasons. That means that we can't always agree in a society, but what society is that true of? Unless we recognize where those differences are and accept them, then essentially what happens is the majority imposes its way on everybody else. I want to say lastly about this, and I speak, I guess, directly to those of us who come from minority backgrounds of all kinds. We can simply say, yeah, okay, we're going to be, and we are like everybody else, we want to fit in and so on. I think some of the people who have entered this debate imagine that they are saying something which will appeal to the liberal mind. I interpret what they're saying as something quite different. I think they are not prepared to stand up for what they are and what they believe. I think some of them are actually ashamed of being black or being Muslims. I'm never going to be ashamed of that. Somebody said to me on the radio a couple of days ago, I had remarked that I come from a background of 1,000 years of Fulani Muslims and Mandinka Muslims, interrupted by slavery. He said, oh, you're not Muslim anyway, so it doesn't matter. Well, actually, so interesting, so disrespectful. In my family, This is a debate we have all the time, that background. My sister, closest to me in age, has converted when she was in her 20s. We're now in our 60s. She's been a Muslim for all her life. Several of my nephews have names that are common amongst West African Muslims because that heritage is meaningful and precious to us. And why? Because we are different and we like our difference. We believe in what we are. We believe in what we are. So when people say, why are you saying people are different? The answer is because I'm proud to be different. I'm proud of my values. That doesn't mean that they're better than anybody else's. I would like to persuade some people to see the world as I do, but if they don't, that's fine. They have principles that are their own, and we will negotiate, and we will have dialogue, and we will talk, and we will live together. But if we do not recognize our differences, what follows is oppression by one or another. I will stop there, but I just want to say to you tonight, thank you for coming along and for hearing me out. This is not just an issue about who gets chucked out of what, where, and what. It is an issue of what kind of society do we want to live in? Is it one in which we recognize our differences, honor them, and respect them, and learn from them? Or is it one in which somebody in some party headquarters decides what it means to be British and tells everybody else?
Thank you, Trevor. Next up, Maajid Nawaz.
Thank you very much, Trevor Phillips, for those remarks. We'll be in conversation together after my remarks, and then we'll open up to questions and comments from all of you as well. I thank you all for being here and coming here despite the fact that, of course, on your travels here, you've had to dodge a virus or two. I appreciate that very much, and I hope you get home safely, considering the fears that are out there. And also, of course, to those that are some watching through the live broadcasting, I hope it works. They can see us, I know it works, but hopefully there are people outside of this room listening as well. And I'd like to begin by saying that Trevor Phillips, first Black president of the National Union of Students, a lifelong anti-racism campaigner, an inspiration to me because, of course, I'm considerably younger than you.
As is most of the world.
An inspiration to me, the inaugural chair of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission that introduced the legislation that protects Muslims like me, and of course, accomplished columnist, and a writer on the Runnymede Trust that coined the phrase Islamophobia. This Muslim, who has memorized half of the Quran and studied the Arabic language and the grammar in depth as well as the Sharia, and that Muslim who just got his PhD on Black American Muslims and integration, Dr. Mohammed Fraser Rahim, and Maajid Nawaz would like to say to you, you are not an Islamophobe. Genuinely disgusts me that you've been called such a thing. I am angry. And that's why when the opportunity arose to have you here tonight, I seized it and pestered you until you agreed, because I think it's incredibly important in times like this when the baying crowd and the mob try and silence and shut people down for having demonstrated a capacity for critical thought while remaining concerned for equality and human rights, that baying crowd needs to be stopped at the gates, and we all need to hold the line and not to allow them to dictate to us how to think and what we can think. Because that is what they are trying to do. You mentioned to be proud of our differences. The kind of society, if those people got their way, they want to see us live in, would be the kind of society that would erase those differences. I, as a Muslim, am no stranger to far-left communist hatred of Muslims. And what they did in the Soviet Union to Chechen Muslims, what they backed in Bosnia, the Russian state, and what they backed in Bosnia against the Muslims there in a genocide, what the Chinese Communist Party is doing today to Muslims, with the internment in concentration camps of 2 million, with harvesting of their organs, with forced marriages, taking children away from their parents, with Huawei as a mobile network company complicit with the Chinese state in the spying of millions of Muslims and their oppression. That's the kind of society that seeks to erase difference in the name of homogeneity and secularism. And so I would like to say that it is incredibly important that we hold the line and do not allow these people to silence debate and silence criticism. The things you've been accused of are things I've said many times, not that it's protected me from accusation either. And the so-called Islamic Human Rights Commission, which is an Iranian state-backed front in this country, that nominated you as Islamophobe of the year before this, also nominated me, as well as, by the way, President Obama. That's who we're dealing with. These are people that would defend the Ayatollahs in Iran who hang gaze from cranes. Let's be in no doubt who we are talking about here. And now you've been called an Islamophobe for citing certain things, and I'd like to repeat to you tonight as data, because we need to be able to have these conversations. To say that we have to be able to talk about the values in this society and what people believe first requires understanding what people believe by surveying them through the only known scientific means and method that we have, and that's through polling. Now, polls aren't 100% correct. I say this all the time, even before elections. But what we cannot do, a bit like dismissing experts and having alternative facts and alternative truth, is just dismiss them because we don't like them. If you don't like a poll, the only thing that can override it is a better poll. And a general election is a better poll than the exit poll that was given before it. And that is why, even though polls can sometimes be wrong, it's only another poll that proves they were wrong. If I predict party X is going to win and party Y wins, that's because the general election is a bigger, better poll than the one I was using. That's the scientific method. What we cannot do is start constructing opinion based on feelings and based upon the fact that otherwise, if you say these things, I fear the rise of the far right. What things am I referring to? Well, the polling data. In 2015, Comrades conducted a poll of British Muslim attitudes after the Charlie Hebdo massacre. And they found that 27% of my fellow British Muslims expressed sympathy for the motives of the attackers. That's data. What are you going to do with that? Pretend it doesn't exist? 11% in the same survey said that magazines that blaspheme deserve to be attacked. 11% of British Muslims is not insignificant. We're worried about coronavirus. It's going to affect 1% of the population. That's 500,000 deaths. 11% is not an insignificant number of people in this country who suggested in 2015, 5 years ago, that magazines that blaspheme deserve to be murdered. We've got to be able to speak about this. Now, I concede that this was 5 years ago. I hope opinions have changed. I genuinely hope so. But we must be able to say this was the last survey done on the issue. And so if you want to prove opinions have moved on since then, do another survey. Don't just say it's not true because you don't like hearing the truth, because of the data doesn't suit your feelings. This is significant because in 2016, a Glasgow shopkeeper was murdered. Guess what? He was a Muslim, but he was killed because he was deemed the wrong kind of Muslim by a jihadist. His name was Asad Shah. He belonged to the Ahmadi sect of Islam. He was killed by a Sunni jihadist because they believe Ahmadis are apostate infidels that insult the Prophet Muhammad and deserve murder. If you go to the Pakistani embassy, my country's heritage, am I now going to be considered anti-Pakistani? Both my parents were born there. And I've done this procedure. You go and apply for a visa, an identity card, which I have as a Pakistan origin, born abroad, or a passport. and they force you by law to fill out a form, not only declaring you are not an Ahmadi Muslim, but also avowing on this form that you declare all Ahmadi Muslims to be infidels. And only by signing that do you get your visa. Check it out, don't try it for yourself. Go to the Pakistan Embassy website. That's happening right here in London. Asad Shah was murdered in 2016 because he was deemed the wrong kind of Muslim by jihadists. That's what happens when 11% of British Muslims surveyed think it's okay to attack people that blaspheme. We've got to be able to have these conversations if we care for human rights and minorities. Because there are minorities within minority communities who are suffering. And Ahmadis are one such minority within minority communities. In a ICM survey of 2016, which I believe you, Trevor, were involved in, 52% of British Muslims surveyed in 2016, 4 years ago now, said that they would criminalize homosexuality in this country. Criminalize. Now, that's not banning gay marriage, which liberals tend to hear whenever I cite this statistic, and they say, are there also Christians against gay marriage? We're not talking about gay marriage here, folks. We are talking about banning being gay and sending you to jail for it. 52% of British Muslims believe this. Again, what's the consequence of this? Well, if you look around the world and find those 10 countries that punish you for being gay by death, they kill you for being gay, surprise, surprise, they are all Muslim majority. They are all Muslim majority. Now, Trevor Phillips was involved in the survey that found that 52% of British Muslims said they wanted to criminalize homosexuality. Is that Islamophobic? To conduct research and find that conclusion and report it? Considering the fact it's incredibly important because in Yemen, the punishment for being gay is stoning by death, stoning to death. In Iran, hanging. In Mauritania, stoning by death, to death. In Saudi Arabia, execution. In Afghanistan, execution. In Somalia, execution. In Sudan, death, but only if you've done it 3 times. In Nigeria, which is it's a mixed country, but the 12 states in the north, which are Muslim majority, have autonomy. Those 12 states in the north that enforce a version of Sharia, the punishment there is also stoning to death. In Qatar, under the adultery laws, the punishment is death. And you all remember the fuss in the media last year when the Sultan of Brunei, the late Sultan of Brunei, tried to introduce death for being gay in Brunei as well. And then they had to suspend it because of the international outcry that hurt them in their pockets. So that's the consequence of understanding when 52% of Muslims in Britain say they want to criminalize being gay. That's what's going on out there in the world. We need to be aware of this. Just because it's people that look like me with names like mine that are engaged in the most brutal forms of homophobia doesn't make it any better and doesn't give you all the right not to speak about it if you claim that you care for minority rights and human rights. The July 7/7 attacks, when surveyed in 2006, that's when the attacks happened, ICM found that 20% of British Muslims expressed sympathy for the feelings and motives of the attackers. Trevor mentioned grooming gangs. We, Quilliam, conducted a survey of this ourselves. 86% of those involved in type 2 child sexual exploitation, which is the grooming of young underage girls, making them believe you're their boyfriend. The people involved in that, I should say type 1 child sexual exploitation, were disproportionately of a Muslim background, predominantly South Asian, primarily Pakistani. My identity, my culture, my family, and my life. We have to be able to have these conversations to understand why is that going on? What is happening? But to shut this conversation down as an example as it's happened here, but as it's happened before, relies on a definition of Islamophobia that's been adopted by the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats, but not by the Conservative Party, that it lazily draws a direct analogy from definitions of anti-Semitism, to the point where it includes this laughable clause that is being recommended to government by the all-party parliamentary group on so-called Islamophobia, and the clause is lifted directly from the Jewish people's right to self-determination as manifested in the form of the State of Israel, incidentally created at the same time as Pakistan was created for Muslims, which nobody calls a racist endeavor. The APPG definition says denying Muslim populations the right to self-determination is a form of Islamophobia. Now let me just ask you this. Prior to this, it says that even questioning somebody's Muslimness is Islamophobia. So by the way, warning to all of you, after everything I've said tonight, if you question my Muslimness, it's you engaging in Islamophobia, not me. I'm still a Muslim despite being critical of internal problems within our community, according to that definition, which is the circular logic. However, going to this point, if you think about it, what does it mean to have self-determination for Muslims when Islam and Muslims is a religious identity? Is it any wonder that Pakistan, which was a state created for Muslims, not for a race of people, and this is where the analogy falls short, because Judaism is a religion, but Jews are also a group of people. They are also a racial group of people, which is why they suffer from both racism or bigotry towards Judaic practices. Islam is not a race. Muslims will be the first to tell you that. So if it's Islamophobic to deny the right to Muslim self-determination when Muslims are a religion and Islam is a religion, is it Islamophobic to deny the right to an Islamic state? Because that's what Muslim self-determination, i.e. religious Muslim self-determination, implies. That's within the definition that the all-party parliamentary group on Islamophobia has adopted, that the Labour Party has adopted. This renders us incapable of challenging Islamism. As distinct from Islam, Islamism is the desire to impose any version of Islam over society. Muslim self-determination is a religious form of self-determination. Is it any wonder then that Pakistan still enforces by law, has on its statutes, I should say, death for blasphemy? Is it any wonder then when recently, last year, Pakistan, its parliament, had legislation to debate to increase the age of marriage? It was shot down by the Supreme Council of Islamic Ideology in Pakistan. Keep in mind what the law was, raising the low age of marriage for girls. And the Supreme Council of Islamic Ideology in Pakistan that governs and supervises all legislation shot it down and said it's Islamophobic to raise the age of marriage for women because the Prophet Muhammad married a 9-year-old. Look it up. Is that what Muslim self-determination means? Is it now Islamophobic to say that? And so this is where we are. This is what we're dealing with. And I would just end on this note to say that it's no surprise. The Southern Poverty Law Centre listed me as an anti-Muslim extremist. I sued them, I won, they had to pay millions. It's well known. I'm not going to repeat that story, but it should have been a warning shot. I've gone to jail because I loved my religion so much. I witnessed torture. I've seen people die before my eyes for Islam in jail. And if I could be listed as an anti-Muslim extremist after all of that, it's no wonder Trevor Phillips isn't safe. But yet here we have a black man who was the first president of the National Union of Students, the first black president of the National Union of Students in this country, the man who authored the report that coined the phrase Islamophobia. Now he's not safe from the accusation. And that is where we find ourselves. If us two cannot have this conversation, where does that leave many of you in this audience? And if this doesn't lead to a chilling of the debate and a silencing of free speech and a shutting down of our ability to think critically for the sake of Muslims in this country, then what other example do you need that we've gone through the looking glass? Thank you very much.
Wonderful. So for the sake of time, I want to allow plenty for dialogue, for question and answer, but I'm mindful of the time. We're at 7:22. I just have 2 questions that I am going to raise, and then allow for you all to kind of engage in a dialogue, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. First, and I think I'm curious your thoughts on, and you both alluded to this a bit, perhaps talk about the rise of anti-Semitism. I mean, we're seeing this very blatant level of anti-Semitism. We're seeing Jewish communities leave London, and they are deeply affected by bigotry So we've unpacked it, anti-Muslim bigotry. Maybe if you could explore a little about anti-Semitism and perhaps the linkages between the far left, far right, and Islamism and some nexus to anti-Semitism. Perhaps if you could entertain me for that.
Yeah, okay. Hey, Maajid, you're on fire, man.
I'm upset. Seriously.
So I'm with you. I'm not. Just if I may say briefly, I was so pleased you raised the issue of the Uyghurs in China. You know, one of the most upsetting thing about this episode is that people are having some kind of seminar room argument about text that I wrote 4 years ago, and getting themselves all excited and, you know, Muslim country, Britain, saying, why are you saying we're different? When you kind of ask, well, if you're not different, why is there a Muslim council? And we have all of that. And then there's two things. Pay data came out last year, highest paid by about 15%. Oh no, more than that, 20% per hour on average Chinese, then Indians, Hindu, then whites, and then who are at the bottom, Pakistani Muslim. The amount of ink that has been spilled on me compared to the amount that has been devoted to the fact of the poverty of 3 million Muslims is just, it's a scandal in terms of priorities. And then on top of that, you've got 1 million people in a concentration camp. And what do these people have to say about that? People who say they care about Muslims and they're interested in me when that's going on. Why aren't they up the street outside the, excuse me, freaking Chinese embassy protecting us? I just have to get out of my chest. On the question of anti-Semitism, interestingly, the Money report in 1997 was actually part of a pair of reports, and we had previously, 1995, published a report entitled Anti-Semitism, a Very Light Sleeper. And the point of that report was to draw attention to the fact that everybody who thought, oh well, we've got over that. There was some nasty stuff that happened in Germany and Poland about 50 years ago, but we've all got over it. And the point that we made in that report is that people always think that, but it is never true, and it has never been true, and it is still not true. The point about anti-Semitism, I think, is that of course it is re-emerging, and it is re-emerging. We know what some of its characteristics are from the far right, but actually the point about the far right and far left is they have a similar idea about the world, that there are some bad people somewhere who are running things, and they are evil, monstrously rich, and if we can pull them down, then it'll be fine. It just happens, by the way, that a lot of them are Jews. That is the view. And it is a view both on the right, far right, and it is a view on the far left. People on the far left kind of comfort themselves with the thought that actually, you know, we're not saying that because they're Jewish. In fact, it's sort of the Jews' fault they get caught up in this kind of thing. And if only they were like the few good Jews who are on the far left, then actually we wouldn't have a problem with Israel because they'd be on the side. You know, all of that sort of nonsense. These are people who I think have two characteristics. First of all, they want to essentialize groups of people. You know, so for example, they don't like Maajid because he doesn't behave like what they think a Muslim should behave like. I had the same experience. And the second thing is that They love the idea that you can invest all evil in a group of nasty people where the rest of us are virtuous. And this is why the point about anti-Semitism is so important. And why, by the way, it is different to any other phenomenon. One of the things that has started to happen is that people talk about racism and anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred as though these are just forms of distaste. They're just sort of bad fashion. Well, I can talk about the others, but let's deal with anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is not just, don't really like the way Jews carry on. It is a worldview. It is a worldview. It is an entire theory. And it says that everything is controlled by this group of people, and if we can destroy that group of people, then we can all be free. And it overlaps in my party, still my party, with those who believe that it's all down to the Americans. Because, why? Because the Americans are controlled by the Jews. And that's why they're so close to Israel. It is all pretty straightforward and simple if you are that kind of person. And the point about the uniqueness of anti-Semitism, and which I think Holocaust Memorial Day, when we started it, focused on, I worry that it doesn't focus on it as much as it should do, is this. Anti-Semitism is not the property of a few people. It becomes the property of a whole nation. In 1933 to 1945, Germans, Poles, Ukrainians, the Austrians, they weren't all out to lunch while the Nazi gangs did their work. Entire industries and entire nations went to work on this project. And this is the hardest thing that we always have to say to ourselves again and again and again. The possibility of that darkness continues to exist because it exists in every single one of us. That's why we would think about anti-Semitism, because it isn't some bad guys over the hill who do it. It's us. That's right.
I don't want to repeat anything Trevor said. I will say that there's a dodgy meme going around online about Trevor's comments, and it's people asking you to replace the word Muslim with what he said with the word Jews and see if it's not racist. It is the most tedious, puerile, and ignorant thing to do when discussing racism. Why? Because, of course, different forms of bigotries work in different ways. If I say certain things about a woman that are sexist, it doesn't mean if I say those same things about a man, it means I'm sexist about the man. Because sexism is a specific, misogyny has a specific history because of the patriarchy, because of male dominance historically, that Trevor alluded to in his speech, in particular recent history with colonialism. There are certain things that would be deemed sexist to say to a woman that are not if you say them to a man. Likewise with homophobia, certain things that are homophobic that wouldn't be racist if you said them to a black man, certain things that are racist that wouldn't be homophobic. The history of Jewish anti-Semitism has a very, very specific print, characteristics that are very specific to it, such as, for example, the money-grubbing trope. That doesn't necessarily apply to a black man. It's not racist necessarily to say that to a black man, whereas it would be to a Jew. And so it's ignorant and actually puerile and tedious to say online, as is happening so much these days, take Trevor's quotes, replace the word Muslims with Jews, and see if it's not racist. There's in fact a video made by the APPG that I refer to that does exactly that, and it's circulating online at the moment. So what I would say is, anti-Semitism has a very specific history to it. It is the only form, I should clarify again, because again, I'm in danger of being misquoted. All racism is bad, but they are different in how they are manifested. I'm not saying one's better than the other. Anti-Semitism is also bad, but it's the one form of racism that is the most dangerous as well, because you cannot think of any other form of racism that unites all three forms of fascism that we are dealing with today. The far left, the far right, and the Islamist theocrats. The one form of racism that unites them all is their hatred for Jews. Now, that doesn't mean that it's better or worse. It just means it's different. It's a different form of racism. I'm not giving them a hierarchy. I'm just saying we have to be aware of how they operate. Like viruses are different. They're all bad, but they operate in different ways. Coronavirus is not the flu. Don't listen to anyone that tells you it is. It's more dangerous, it's more potent, it's more lethal, it's more contagious, and it lasts longer, especially on the screen of your iPhone. So please clean your iPhones. However, just like that, all viruses are bad, but some operate in different ways to others. Anti-Semitism is the only form of racism that unites all three extremes. We see that playing out across Europe today, and it's why we must be especially aware, because that's the one form of racism that could come from me or you. But if you're a black man, you're unlikely to be racist against black people. If you're a Muslim, you're unlikely to hate other Muslims. But actually, if you're far left, if you're far right, if you're Muslim, there are people out there that subscribe to these views, and they actually cooperate in their hatred for Jews. We've seen that happen in our own work. We've seen this cooperation among people that should otherwise hate each other.
And great, so let's allow for some question and answer, because I think that will be rather fruitful and just to condense down time. So I think we have a mic that's going around. It should be going around. There you go. So please stand up, and then we'll make sure to answer your question. Our colleague might have stepped out, so we'll come back with the mic in a second. But please, the gentleman in the back, please.
Oh, just stand up and project my voice.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. I thought
We'll get you the mic. He just stepped out probably for a second. But.
All right. I think I'm probably here. I am a white Christian male. I'm quite proud of it. So I want to ask a question. I think it's very noble, the conversation that you're having, but why have you glossed out Christophobia and anti-Christian prejudice? When you mentioned all those countries that persecute homosexuals, many of those same countries persecute Christians. When you mentioned the poor soul that was killed in Scotland because of his idea, Nissa Hussain, who was a convert from Islam in Bradford, there was an attempt to kill him by Muslim extremists in the UK. He's not the only Christian that would be able to talk about the kind of prejudice that comes from that. So I'm just wondering why this conversation has glossed over anti-Christian prejudice.
I mean, you raise a good point. The plight of Christians in the Middle East is terrible. And in Egypt, where roughly 15 to 20% of the population are Coptic Christians, they are also suffering there. Forgive me, this was specifically today about anti-Muslim bigotry and anti-Semitism. Are you okay there?
Yeah.
No, not you. Sorry, I just saw. Are you okay? Oh, I think it's water. Sorry, I thought somebody vomited. I just had to make sure that the hall was safe because that so yes, it's definitely an issue. However, because this was specific today about what's been alleged over the last couple of days, I didn't have time. I could have spoken about women and honor killings. I could have spoken about other religious minorities as well. So that's the only reason, just because I wanted to address the specific allegations around the meaning of Islamophobia, which is why the intra-community anti-Muslim bigotry, one type of Muslim against another, was also why I raised the Ahmadi community as well. But you're not wrong to point that out.
Great, next question, please.
Hi, thank you.
Just stand up.
Thank you for everything you said. I wanted to ask, how would you broach this subject to young activists and organisations who are involved in these kind of subjects? So I think the way that we talk about these things are really interesting, and I think a lot of people of my generation are kind of stuck in these ways of discussing things because of things like generational trauma. So I think things like there's a lot of intersections with this kind of dialogue with things like gender and race. So how would you broach the subject, and how would you engage people who kind of have reason to believe and have opinions and the way we feel? I completely agree with everything you're saying, but I grew up in a very very mixed group of people where actually most of my friends weren't white and most of my friends weren't of any specific background. So I think kind of the audience is very important to how these discussions are had. So what would your advice be in terms of discussing?
I think this is a really, thank you, I think this is a really big issue. It would be very easy to say, well, you just have to tell people and stop them being such snowflakes, etc., all that stuff. I don't really buy that. I mean, coming back to what I said earlier on, you can cut it in a different way. Young people today believe what they believe. It's quite a long way from where I am now, and actually probably quite a long way from where I was when I was a teenager and in my 20s. But that's because the world has changed. So when people, you know, I have a daughter who is, so embarrassing, I've got a daughter that's older than you are. She worked for a large organisation which she told me last week has banned the phrase "the elephant in the room," and it is a largish organisation of, I think it's probably got about 1,000, 1,500 people working for it. It's a big, it's a tech outfit, so everybody's like 21, and so on. And everybody takes it tremendously seriously, and they feel it. Now, there's no point in marching in there and going,
Why?
Oh,
That's why.
well, she does not know. It's a straight answer, but fattest, correct? Yeah. It's come on, guys, get with the program. It is fattest. I mean, but look, this is the reaction. But if I may say so, it is not the right reaction, because I think people are saying that for a real one. My view about this is the only way to address this is to do two things. First of all, present people with an actual problem, because I think one of the reasons we get into these things is that people are having the argument about what's in their heads and what's in their feelings. If you present people with, let's take that example, the question of, are we, in our workplace, are we giving people the opportunity and space to exercise and be healthy? That question becomes a more concrete one, and people stop getting into seminar room nonsense about this word and that word, and the word is a violence and so on. So my general approach to this is to say, yep, buy that. Now, what is the actual problem that somebody might experience, which is to do with weight and body shape and so on a day-to-day basis, and what can we do to help that person? Because I think once somebody says, can we actually do something for somebody, it becomes a bit difficult because I know what happens here. There are bullies in the room who want to win the argument and then go back and start eating puff pastry because that's okay for them. I think the way to do this is to bring people down to the actual real world dilemmas that real people that you're working with in the space face. And the other thing is, actually, one thing I've always found very useful is to say, put yourself in, not in your shoes, and I know the jargon now is check your privilege and all that, but actually it's quite a good thing to do, to say, put yourself in the shoes, for example, of a black person. And no doubt somebody will tell you about how we're discriminated against and so on. But one of the things they won't think about is what is important to most black folk in this country, and probably I think in the United States. How can my church help me? That's never part of the conversation about, but that's actually what real black people's lives are really about and dominated by. Sometimes it's helpful to say to people, just don't just put yourself in this person's shoes when you want to show how compassionate you are. Put yourself fully in their shoes. And by the way, try and imagine what it feels like to be in that community and have as a norm that we don't want our children to be LGBT. Try and understand that. And I think somehow that sometimes gets the conversation to be a bit less self-centered and airy-fairy, and helps people to confront the real issues that we really face in trying to make big decisions about how we live.
Gentleman in the front, right here. You.
Thanks, guys. My question first to Trevor. I admire your work greatly. If you could discuss a little bit about the role of euphemism and how the term Islamophobia has itself become a kind of catch-all phrase to stifle criticism of Islam as a religion. And to Maajid, the same kind of question, but in a slightly different way. The role of Orwell in your leaving Islamism, and how this could potentially be a solution for the totalitarian scumbags that we're analysing tonight.
I'll just quickly deal with that one. I haven't read it yet because it just was published yesterday, but I did email myself the link. Those of you who are fans of Orwell, and those of you who don't, thank you for asking me clearly from my work, because I'm a huge fan of Orwell. He's been instrumental in my own turnaround, having read every single book he's written. And I just think he's not only a genius, actually, for me, he's a compass, he's a litmus test. If I'm in any doubt as to whether I'm on the right side of the debate, I do try and find out, seek guidance from Orwell. But there's an introduction that has just been discovered to the US version of Animal Farm, or was it 1984? Forgive me, because this news just came out yesterday, and it's previously unpublished. And the New York Times just published it because it was rediscovered. It's written by Orwell himself. And so imagine my excitement. Of course, I didn't have time to read it yet because we've been busy trying to prepare for this, but I'm going to read it. The commentary I read when it was posted is why I refer to it now, because it's significant. And what it reveals apparently, because I haven't read it yet, forgive me, but what it apparently reveals, according to the commentary of the person that drew it to my attention, is that Orwell's concern for the silencing of free speech when he was writing was primarily directed at the left-wing intelligentsia in Britain at the time. Which would be a fascinating thing to learn, because of course everyone claims Orwell. I've always had a suspicion Animal Farm is about socialism, and well, more than a suspicion, right? But this would pretty much confirm that. Of course, whereas 1984 you could say is about fascism, Animal Farm is about socialism. And I think that's the point there. I think Orwell understood something, that actually if you go too far that way or too far that way, like the horseshoe theory, you go too far left or too far right, you end up at the top of the horseshoe, and that's totalitarianism, authoritarianism. And that's what we have to be wary of. And unfortunately, because of the fact that the left were involved generally with Europe in defeating Nazism, we're finally attuned to the dangers of far-right Nazism. We take for granted the dangers of the far left and authoritarianism because the Soviet Union were our allies against Nazism in World War II. And so unfortunately, there hasn't been, I think, in the public consciousness as much of an awareness until recently with the Labour Party, there hasn't been as much as an awareness about the danger of going too far left. But I will say to you now, I'll say it again here tonight in this hall. As far as I'm concerned, the Chinese Communist Party is the continuity USSR. And that's how we need to see it. And as we have the continuity IRA, or some of them call themselves the real IRA, even though you defeat the terrorist group through peace, there are always some nincompoops that decide they want to carry on the struggle of terrorism. And likewise with the Soviet Union. Yes, it collapsed, the USSR collapsed, but the Chinese Communist Party still reigns over a huge chunk of land, over 1 billion people, and still does everything Stalin did with gulags and concentration camps, ethnic cleansing. That's what they're doing right now. Because we otherize the poor victims of that ideology, who are Chinese people, because we otherize them in the West, we're not as aware of what's going on there, and we're signing deals with Huawei. But that state is today the continuity USSR, and that's how we should view it.
Can I just respond to that? By the way, just quickly say, coming back, I agree with you about China, and I will tell you that the person who held the equivalent job that I did at the HRC in China came to see me and to ask some advice. And I said, "You're China, I can't advise. I have no idea." He said, "Oh well, I said, "How many different ethnic groups you've got to deal with?" "We got 17 here." And he said, "Oh, about 180. I said, "I haven't really got much advice for you, mate. Maybe the other way around." But the point about I wanted to make about this is that, going back to what I said earlier on, that the issue is in us. Han Chinese think it's okay to do this to us. They think it's okay because actually it will educate them. And the party has used that relentlessly. On the question about euphemisms, well, you know, I'm not a literary fellow like Maajid. I'm a chemist by trade, actually. I was trained as a chemist. I did 5 years of pointless research. But what I don't like and I'm not good at, is lack of precision. I don't really understand euphemism. What I will say about it is this, and why it's now become very dangerous, why the Islamophobia thing is very dangerous. It's deliberately vague. It's deliberately broad. In the same way as on some issues of feminism, the definition of what is not good is deliberately broad. Because what is now happening, particularly in universities, it's also happening to some extent in media organisations, is that there's no offence of Islamophobia, there's no offence of transphobia, but there are these definitions floating about. And if you can get enough noise going about something that somebody has said or done within the organisation or around it, then the organisation's authorities and leadership have to consider that. And what do they consider it against? They consider it against the definition that people are shouting about, even though it has no legal standing. And what then happens is, you don't get sacked for Islamophobia. You get sacked for bringing the organisation into disrepute, which is a statutory problem. But you brought it into disrepute because a lot of people have been yelling that you've done something wrong because of a definition that doesn't really have any standing. So what we're now seeing is the euphemisms, which are actually not euphemisms, they are broadly drawn, vague catch-alls, are being used to give the mob power. Because if you can give them the excuse to shout about your Islamophobia, your turfness, or whatever it is, at the moment, most of our authorities are so spineless, what they will do is they'll say, too much trouble, get rid of them. That's what's going on.
We're going to do, for the next 5-10 minutes, we're going to do short responses between the two wonderful speakers. Hannah.
Thank you, guys. Trevor, Maajid mentioned some of your polling recently that looked at British Muslim opinion, and I know there was quite a diversity of thought was found. But as you yourself said earlier, in recent days, some of the so-called representative groups like the Muslim Council of Britain have come out against you, called your comments dangerous. I'm interested to hear what your thoughts on the MCB's criticism of you and what you think they might be trying to achieve. And I'm also interested in your thoughts on the extent to which they do represent British Muslim opinion.
Yeah. I don't really have many thoughts about the MCB. I don't think they ever say anything these days that are worth much, to be absolutely frank. I think their objective is to establish themselves as the sole voice in British life of the Muslims, not the Muslim community, because there isn't a single Muslim community, we all know that. But they want to establish themselves as the only legitimate expression of Muslim opinion in Britain. What does that mean? Well, it means that they end up They put themselves in a place where they have to be consulted by government, local authorities, where they want, where they exercise a veto, particularly over media organisations. And any editor of any national newspaper will tell you that they get a complaint pretty much every single day from the Muslim Council of Britain. Now, most smart ones and courageous people go, oh, for God's sake, then they miss it out. But what, of course, is happening is, little bit by little bit, it's happening in universities, it's happening in government, it's happening in media organisations, is that people are going, well, we want to say this, we want to do this piece of work, we want to run this kind of article, but we know we're going to get a heat, and we're going to have to answer it, and it's going to take time and money. Let's do this thing over here. So actually, by pure persecution and nuisance value, the Muslim Council of Britain is essentially censoring our media already, and they're censoring it according to an agenda that has, I think, two principal aims. First of all, to establish themselves as a kind of effective, holding an effective veto over what is said in the public sphere. By the way, even if it's got nothing to do with actually being a Muslim, it's got, you know, they comment on all sorts of other things. And secondly, they want to intimidate people, actually, both outside the Muslim community, but even more importantly, inside the Muslim community.
Why is that?
Actually.
Why?
Because Maajid is better on the politics of this than I am, but I think that the central point is that the people who, and the political parties around and behind the Muslim Council of Britain, see this country as an extremely significant player in the Muslim world. They want the Muslim community here to have and express a particular point of view. They also want to be the only conduit to government and other big players in this country. And it's, you know, they're playing a great game. They're playing a great game. They're doing very well, and we're letting them win.
There's not much time for, because we want to get more questions. I will very quickly say to you that as of last survey, only 2%, 1.9% of British Muslims said that the MCB represents them in politics. So fine, organise your prayers in your mosques. Don't pretend that you represent British public opinion, Muslim opinion, and I'll say that the leadership committee of the MCB, when somebody asks why, the reason is that the leadership committee of the MCB runs by a collegiate system and is disproportionately influenced by a group known as Jamaat-e-Islami, which is the Muslim Brotherhood equivalent of South Asia. They are, Jamaat-e-Islami is an Islamist group that seeks power through elections, not violence, but nevertheless believes in theocracy. And they have a disproportionate influence over the MCB leadership through the collegiate system, a bit like unions have a disproportionate influence over the Labour Party. That's what's happening inside the MCB. Their former leadership contender, Mohammed Amin, tried to go up against this, lost. Then he became the head of the Conservative Muslim Forum. He resigned the Conservative Party because of Boris Johnson, but he's a religious Muslim, but you know, he's an insider that can speak to you about this as well.
We're going to do lightning round. If you allow, we'll take the questions and then we'll have them respond. So maybe we'll pass it around and then we'll move through so we can get through as many as possible, please.
Okay, you said something about if you're a Muslim, you're less likely to be racist. I'm from, my family are Muslims, and I'll just like to sort of just say a few things from the sort of Quran and Islamic text, which I feel has led to Muslims being racist towards black people. Things like black people are going to hell, things like black people, Satan looks like a black man, black people are cursed. So I just wonder if you're aware of these texts within the Islamic, and is there anything being done about Muslim hatred, as opposed to, I know you're addressing hatred towards Muslims through the Islamophobia law, but is there anything being done about Muslim hatred towards black people and Christians?
Let's see if we can get through them just quickly.
Hi, Sahel Ahmed. I'm a former extremist. I was almost on the verge of kind of violence at one point, and Maajid's work helped me just reading and listening to his work. I just wanted to ask the question, do you regret introducing the term Islamophobia? And also, you've got powerful people like Maajid Nawaz to help you when you've been accused of Islamophobia. What do the small people do?
Stop using the word.
Yeah, let's just try to get it through as many.
Hi, Maajid and Trevor. Firstly, massive fan of both your work, and thank you for your continued support of the Jewish community. We need every champion we can get at the moment, it seems. Quick question about what happened to you in the Labour Party, Trevor. Have you?
I can't see what it is.
It's me.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Have you considered the absurdity of your very quick expulsion from the party because of comments based and rooted in fact, when compared to the thousands and thousands of people accused of anti-Semitism, where the Labour Party, refused to act or, took a long time to?
Do you want to do these three and then? Let's try to do a few more.
Hi, thank you very much. Following on from the topic at hand, I was wholly ignorant of all aspects of anti-Muslim hatred, anti-Semitism on the far left, right, and Islamism. So I asked my friends for a question that could be thought-provoking. So it's three statements to discuss what you think. It was the far right hates the banker because they are Jewish, the far left hates the Jew because they are bankers, and the Islamist hates the Jew because they are Jewish. So your thoughts on that?
Very good. Do you want any more? I wish I'd written that.
Actually,
Nobody heard that. When it appears in the newspaper. I'm so clever.
Just a quick question back to the anti-Semitism point about the Labour Party and the report that's been given to the HRC and what you think the likely outcome of that report will be.
That's what I tried.
I was going to ask that.
Okay. So one more. Gentleman over here. Stay there. There you go.
Hi, I was just wondering what you guys thought about the role of cults of personality in these extremist groups, whether it be Robinsons, the Chowdhuries, or the Corbyns of this world, and how do we undermine these in the political process?
All the Mark collects, we address them. Sorry to put that in. The biggest danger I'm seeing at the moment is the ex-youth leader of the BNP starting a political party called the Patriotic Alternative, which is the most anti-Semitic and anti-LGBT movement I've seen. They're starting a, there's a hashtag campaign starting today from the far right. I vote on the right, and I'm on the campaign that we thrown off a building in Iraq. So, are you aware of the Groypers and the? What's your opinion of them? I'd really like to know.
So I'm only going to say two of those questions for brevity, and I think Trevor's, because he's been furiously writing down, maybe take the rest. A lot of them were actually more relevant to you than me, but the anti-black racism, yes, definitely. I think you may have misheard me. I said a Muslim is less likely to hate other Muslims, and a black man is less likely to hate other black people. I do accept that racism among Arabs and South Asians against black people is at critical levels, definitely. And there's a history behind that, and not least because of the history of slavery, which Arabs were also involved in, which doesn't get spoken about enough. And there are scriptures, what you were citing isn't specifically scripture, but there is scripture that is racist against black people, which relates especially to slavery. And the common word in the Gulf till this day, unfortunately, to refer to black people is abd. In Arabic, I'm fluent in Arabic, abd, which means slave. And so there are big problems. Now, there are also counter-examples, and there are positives. And people who try and create a new and alternative narrative point to, for example, the first man to give the call to prayer as a prophet's companion, Bilal, who was a black man. But there are definitely issues there, just like there are about Christians in the Middle East, and the discrimination against them too. But actually what you'll find is generally in the Middle East, kind of region where ISIS emerges from, any kind of minority you look at is going to have these sorts of problems, because unfortunately it's a developing world that has of late been engulfed by an extreme form of theocratic thinking based on a Muslim supremacy. And that's unfortunately going to mean bad news for all other groups that aren't primarily in the Sunni world, Sunni Muslims. And of course, Iran is a Shiite Islamist theocracy as well. The Groypers question here, yes, I'm definitely aware of one of them prank called my LDC show. The Groypers, for those of you who haven't heard of this is a phenomenon. Just think of, it's the new alt-right. It's an offshoot of the Richard Spencer alt-right, which is even more extreme, even more anti-Semitic, even more homophobic, even more paranoid about this conspiracy theory that Europe will no longer be white as a majority in 50 years' time, which is a misreading of the data based on current birth rates. Just give you one example. It assumes birth rates continue as they are. My mother is one of 9 siblings. I only have 2 children. So, I mean, that's what happens to birth rates. But the assumption that Muslims are going to continue having 9 is the basis upon which these fanatics, conspiracy theorists think that the white man won't be in a majority in Europe in 50 years' time. Britain is still 87% white. People say London, which is true, is no longer majority white, but it's still majority British. The only way you get around that is by pretending I'm not British. London is still majority British. It may not be majority white British, but that's because a lot of us who are born here were born and raised in the southeast. But actually, Britain is still 87% white as well. So these Groypers, they are active online with hashtags. They are largely anonymous, but they are vehemently, just think, more anti-Semitic than Richard Spencer, the Tiki Torch people in America, that protest where they said the Jews will not replace us. These are people that think that lot aren't extreme enough. Yeah, so we do need to be aware of this. We live in polarizing times, we live in extremist times, and it's why it's so important to have conversations like this, because actually, I do think our future, to keep us safe, pluralistic, tolerant, democratic, and small L liberal, is going to be through these sorts of conversations where we appreciate we can be different, but actually there are certain values we will share, and it's those values we want to reinforce.
Yeah, on the question from the lady back, I know nothing at all about this, but it did, sorry, this slight mildly irrelevant. I'd like to find out, yeah. This is a mildly irrelevant point, but the Song of Solomon begins with the words from Solomon to the Queen of Sheba, who is Yemeni princess, and he's actually a black Israelite, and Solomon says, "I am black but comely, O Sheba," and the worst chat-up line in the world. Anyway, three quick. I don't know why I said that. Let's ask the woman that word. Anyway, 3 quick questions. Speed of expulsion versus. I mean, it's mad, isn't it? They take years and years to deal with people who are manifestly anti-Semite or their behaviour is such. But that's because people at the top of the Labour Party buy the conspiracy thing. And I think they actually think is that the people who are being, who are alleged anti-Semites, they think these people are victims because they are standing up for the Palestinian people and so on and so forth. But they, you know, what can I say? Alistair Campbell, who's a friend of mine, basically got expelled within 24 hours of saying that he had voted for a Liberal Democrat. And I remember seeing him in the evening and saying, bloody hell, I've been going on about the leader's anti-Semitism for 2 years, and they still haven't expelled me. I mean, what's so special about you? Well, actually, it's pretty obvious what's special about Alistair Campbell and not me, but now I've got my wish. I think it's obviously that this is not being applied. And by the way, I suspect that what has happened to me, it will emerge as not unique. I happen to be fortunate to have the background and the resource and the platform to speak about it, but I suspect that there are a lot of party members who don't have any of those advantages, for whom this is also true, by the way, on the same grounds. On the question of the EHRC, I cannot tell you what I think the answer to that is. I left the commission 8 years ago. David Isaacs, who is the current chair, behaves very properly. We see each other regularly because he speaks my advice, like he seeks lots of other people's advice about technical issues and so on, but he has never divulged anything to me on this. What I can say is that my guess is that they are probably in the process of writing that report. One of the reasons that there's uncertainty about when it's going to come out is that when you do that, and I did some big ones on the police, on the killing of Maajid Nawaz in Felton Prison and so on, one of the things you have to do is you have to give the draft report to people who are criticised in it, and they have to have the opportunity to respond, and they can take forever. And I suspect, if you're the Labour Party, what would you do? I suspect that, I think this will be a test of whoever the new leader is, whether they get their response out so that report could see the light of day. And on the last question, do I regret the Islamophobia report? I don't go in for regret, to be honest. You do what you do at any given time in the best faith. And sometimes it doesn't go the way you want it to go. I stand by what we did because what we did was to illuminate the disadvantages and discrimination faced by people which could not be attributed to their race. And of course, because we were heading towards a place where there are a lot of people who are, lots of Eastern Europeans who are Muslims, but don't look Asian, but might face issues to do with their practice and their needs as Muslims. I felt that we had to highlight that. I think we were right to do so. What is happening now, of course, is that that work is being taken and being transformed into something different. Rather in the way, if you read Lord of the Rings, one of the things that somebody asked, what is the origins of the orc? What are the origins of the orcs? And what Tolkien tells you is that the orcs are elves who were taken and tortured and stretched and deformed into a completely different and ugly and vicious form. And I think something like that has happened with what we try to do on Islamophobia. We simply tried to create a situation where people who are not being treated equally would be protected. And then some other people who have got completely different purposes have taken that and tried to turn it into something different. But every year, every generation brings its own battle. And this is a new battle. It's one that we have to fight. And I have to be frank with you, it's going to be ugly. And people will, what's happening to me it's nothing. I'm a person who can deal with this. The people I really feel for are people in local councils who are being hauled into HR. People who are teachers who are being hauled up before their department heads and told, we heard you say that this is where this really bites. People like me can dramatize it, but the real hurt are on the people you never hear from. And this is the ugly part of this battle. And all I can say is I'll do my part, but I hope everybody in this room listens, looks, and doesn't walk by on the other side when you see this happen. Because that will happen every month from now on.
We appreciate you coming. Please pay close attention to our various events that we have, certainly here in the United Kingdom, but also around the world, including in America. Let's give our speakers a final round of applause.
Oh, yeah.